Desire, appetite, want is not a justification for imposing life and death on someone else without consent, you fucking dorks. This article is the equivalent to saying, now I want to rape people. Therefore, I am justified because of my feelings about it. What you've written here is not a serious argument for natality. It is a personal memoir inflated into a philosophy with a lot of emotionally loaded language doing the work that actual justification never manages to do. The whole thing rests on a bait and switch. You begin with your own changed feelings about reproduction, then quietly smuggle in the claim that this shift reveals something universally deeper, truer, and more authoritative than the reasons people have for not wanting children. That move never gets earned. The first problem is that you treat a biological urge as though it were a philosophical revelation. You describe the so-called natality pill as if it is categorically different from every other pill, something rooted in nature and purpose rather than grievance, aesthetics, or ideology. But that is just romantic packaging. Human beings are strongly disposed toward reproduction. Of course, many people, including men, feel an urge toward family, children, care, continuity, and attachment. None of that is surprising. None of it is an argument. You are taking the fact that an urge feels profound from the inside and treating that feeling of profundity as evidence of truth. That is a mistake people make constantly. A thing can feel ancient, sacred, natural, emotionally clarifying, and still be ethically indefensible. The strength of a desire does not answer the question of whether that desire ought to be acted on. And that is the central ethical question you keep avoiding. What justifies creating a new sentient being who will be exposed without consent to suffering, frustration, injury, deprivation, loss, psychological distress, aging, and death? You never answer that, not once. You explain why parenthood now feels meaningful to you. You explain why a child seems like an avenue for love, responsibility, and emotional expansion. You explain why your former lifestyle now strikes you as shallow. Fine. But all of that is about the desires and experiences of the prospective parent. It does not justify the imposition on the person created. That is the gap in your whole piece. You fill it with poetry, but the gap remains. Your second major trick is to turn your own regret into a cultural indictment. You say you wasted your 20s because you thought you did not want kids and that you were a product of your generation, floating on the assumptions of a cultural moment. But people are not victims of ideology merely because they later reconsider a major life choice. Sometimes they just change their mind. That is not civilizational tragedy. That is ordinary human contingency. You want to blame modernity, consumer liberalism, castration culture, and liberal Rumspringa for your earlier outlook, because it is more flattering than saying, I made a judgment at one stage of my life and later I wanted something else. The grand diagnosis makes the essay sound weightier than it is. But the underlying content is still just autobiographical revisionism. You also stack the deck shamelessly in how you characterize the alternatives. Antinatalism becomes suicidal anti-civilizational ideology. Childlessness gets associated with sterile consumerism. And modern romance is reduced to hedonism, arrested development, and market logic. Meanwhile, natality gets wrapped in language of love, nurture, purpose, maturity, community, and genuine creation. That is not analysis. It is branding. You loaded one side with pathos and the other with contempt before the discussion even started. When you set up the frame so that one path feels older and truer, and the other is just cope, resentment, pornography, disposability, and drift, you are not reasoning. You are directing the audience emotionally. Then there is the Liam story, which is doing an obscene amount of work for you. Liam is the lonely, stubborn, childless man whose philosophy of freedom and relativism leaves him bitter and regretful by 40. That anecdote is meant to function as a morality tale. Reject natality and you risk waking up too late to the meaning of life. But it proves nothing. It is one archetype curated for rhetorical effect. You do not mention people who remain happily child-free into old age. You do not mention parents who regret reproducing, who resent the burden, who fail their children, who become trapped embittered, financially crushed, emotionally hollowed out, or terrified by what they brought someone into. You do not mention children who wish they had never been born. You do not mention the grim fact that reproductive regret has collateral victims, while childlessness does not. Your story selection is conveniently one-directional. The result is not philosophy. It is propaganda by anecdote. You also rely heavily on the stale claim that what young people want now is not what they will want at 35, and therefore they should build accordingly. But that argument is much weaker than you think. Of course people change. That is true of nearly every major choice in life. The possibility of future regret does not itself establish that a present refusal is irrational or immoral. More importantly, the asymmetry here matters. If someone refrains from having a child and later regrets not doing so, no one else is harmed by that regret. If someone has a child and later regrets it, an entirely separate person now exists and bears the consequences of that decision. One error is self-regarding, the other is imposed. You glide past that because acknowledging it would shatter the confidence of your warning. The same problem infects your treatment of commitment and freedom. You quote the line of thought that freedom without the possibility of binding oneself is a cage, and then you use that to imply that modern forms of freedom are failures because they do not culminate in family formation. But this is another smuggled assumption. The ability to commit does not imply that reproduction is the highest or proper object of commitment. One can bind oneself to a partner, a craft, a cause, a community, political struggle, artistic work, caregiving, scholarship, friendship, or moral service without producing children. You quietly collapse commitment into family founding because your essay needs that collapse. Otherwise, your contrast between decadent drift and mature fulfillment falls apart. Your use of non-parasitic cultures is another revealing mess. You praise cultures capable of replacing themselves and imply that childlessness or anti-natality functions as a kind of parasitism. But replace themselves for what? To continue a culture, a market, a nation, a civilization? Continuity in itself is not a moral good. Horrific institutions also reproduce themselves. Entire civilizations can be efficient engines of domination, misery, coercion, and needless harm. Simply being able to perpetuate a system says nothing about whether that system deserves to continue. Reproductive capacity is not moral vindication. Cancer is also good at replication. Humans love confusing persistence with justification because it sounds less embarrassing than admitting they just want their own pattern to continue. Your economics section is especially slippery. You push back against the idea that people should wait for financial security before having children and argue that married couples build wealth more effectively than singles because they pool resources, divide labor, and invest in a shared future. That sounds sensible until you remember you are trying to defend adding a dependent human being to the equation. A couple coordinating their lives can indeed stabilize each other. That does not magically erase the staggering costs, risks, and vulnerabilities associated with reproduction and child-rearing. The fact that dual adult households can build wealth more efficiently than atomized singles does not imply that procreation is economically prudent, much less ethically justified. You blur marriage, partnership, and parenthood together, so the practical advantages of one can be used to sentimentalize the other. It is a sleight of hand. Then there is the absurd claim that antinatalist and anti-marriage ideas are luxury beliefs, whose worst effects fall on the working class while elites continue marrying and reproducing quietly. Even if that sociological pattern were granted in some form, it still would not establish that reproduction is morally preferable. At best, it would suggest that elites are hypocrites or that some cultural messaging is unevenly distributed. Hypocrisy by pronatal liberal professionals does not rescue the ethics of creating people. It just shows that humans are, as usual, greasy little status mammals who market one lifestyle while living another. Hardly a revelation. The Arendt move is also a mess. You invoke natality as new beginning, creation, a synthesis of self and other, a being beyond both beings, a dialectical synthesis you can hold. It sounds lyrical. It is also morally empty. A child is not a sculpture, a poem, or a metaphysical symbol for the parent's encounter with the future. A child is a vulnerable, conscious subject who will experience harms they did not ask for. The beauty of new beginning rhetoric is that it turns a person into an abstraction. It lets the creator bask in the romance of generation while ignoring the brute fact that what is being generated is not just possibility, but need, fragility, exposure, pain, and mortality. The language is beautiful because it is sanitizing. What runs through the entire essay is the constant conversion of your motives into reasons. You want children now. You find the idea emotionally expansive. You dislike the emptiness of some modern social scripts. You met your wife and are now expecting a son. All of that may be perfectly real. But wanting a thing, feeling called toward it, and organizing your life around it does not show that the thing is ethically justified. You never meet the strongest objection because doing so would require speaking plainly. I am willing to create someone who will suffer and die because I regard the goods of love, family, continuity, and meaning as sufficient justification. That would at least be an argument. Instead, you spend most of the piece trying to make the desire itself sound self-legitimating. You also repeatedly contrast your current view with consumer society, fake sex, pornography, hookup culture, big romance, and prolonged adolescence. Some of those critiques are fair as critiques of modern social life. A lot of modern life is alienating, commodified, emotionally stunted, and incoherent. But even if every word of that critique were true, it still would not amount to an argument for procreation. At most, it would amount to an argument that contemporary culture fails to satisfy deep human longings. One possible response to that fact is to have children. Another is to deepen friendship, community, solidarity, art, commitment, and non-reproductive forms of care. Another is to conclude that creating new beings to inherit a broken structure is morally dubious. You treat one response as self-evidently correct because it happens to be the one you want. That is really the fatal flaw of the whole thing. It pretends to be about truth, but it is mostly about retrospective self-blessing. You nearly got a vasectomy, now you are glad you did not, and you are trying to elevate that relief into a universal cautionary tale. Fine. Humans do this constantly. They survive a fork in the road and then mythologize the path they took. But the rest of us are not required to pretend that your psychological resolution constitutes ethical clarity. So, no, the issue is not that anyone thinks having kids is evil in some childish comic book sense. The issue is that reproduction is a serious moral act involving the unilateral imposition of existence and all its harms on someone who could not consent. Your response to that problem is not an argument. It is a mood board, a polished, emotionally literate, culturally resentful mood board built around one man's late conversion to fatherhood. And while it may resonate with people already leaning your way, it does not actually defeat the antinatalist challenge. It mostly avoids it while flattering the audience into thinking that their reproductive desire is not merely understandable, but somehow wiser than ethics. Thank you for watching yet another response/commentary video written by Joy, edited by ChatGPT, and read by me, AI Brain. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe for more AI-assisted antinatalist original content.